First of all, I'd like to thank Shearman Sterling and Stuart Fleischman for hosting this event. It's a great venue for this important event. I'd like to also recognize Lucia Maria Maera from the consulate and Ministro Roberto Ardenghi from the consulate as well. And the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce has worked jointly to present this panel on education with the Worldfund. This event coincides with their gala dinner last night, which was really quite inspiring about what they're doing and the role that education plays in progressing really society. The fact that this Chamber of Commerce is involved in education is a reflection that without education, which creates prosperity, there won't be the flows that chambers generate. So I think it's all reflective of that. I'll also say a very distinguished crowd here. We have set the record for the most PhDs per audience in our history. Finally, I'm going to turn this over to Kelly, who will be our moderator and explain things. It turns out that we worked together at Manufacturers Hanover Trust in the early 80s, and we both agreed that we haven't changed a bit. Okay? So with that, Kelly, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ted, and I agree with you 100%. I guess this is working, so this is good. I will do a little presentation here to introduce our guest. Fábio, if you could come up to the panel, that would be great, and Ronaldo too. Thank you. I'd like to introduce David Thornburg. David's been a friend of ours for about several years. David is a keynote speaker for STEM in many, many events throughout the United States. And he's a futurologist, so he can talk to us a lot about STEM globally, not only in Brazil. And we have Fábio, our honoree from last night's event. And Fábio is representing the private sector. Fábio is with Itaú-Social now, and he can talk to us a lot about what the private sector is doing with education in Brazil. We have Ronaldo Lemos, who will talk to us a lot about technology. And we have great things to hear from him. And lastly, Marcos Paim, the director for STEM Brazil. Let me come over here. Let's see if this is working. One of the things that we noticed in Brazil, the Brazilophiles like myself, is that technology for many years has been very sophisticated in Brazil. About 20 years ago, mark-to-market in Brazil was every 15 minutes in the financial markets. And in the United States at that time, it was every 24 hours. And there are many things such as voting in Brazil, which are a lot more advanced, the voting technological systems than here. David has some great stories about corporates who have searched worldwide for the best technological employees, and they end up in the northeast of Brazil sometimes. So these are some of the things that we are looking at in education, because we are trying to prepare students for the future, and we don't know exactly what that future is going to look like, especially as far as technology. Luann, when she started the program of STEM Brazil, our founder from Worldfund, she spoke to executives in Brazil and asked what education improvements were needed there around 10 years ago. And a lot of the executives from Brazil were saying, we need more engineers to support the growth and the infrastructure growth and the technology. We need more qualified employees to service a lot of the infrastructure expansion. And that's why she started STEM Brazil. So I'd like to now ask introduce David, and if David could give us a brief introduction about some of the challenges we see in STEM jobs and professions.
Right. Okay, well, I'm thrilled to be here. Last night was such a marvelous event, and as a result, I'm thrilled to be anywhere, but especially here today. And one of the things I wanted to mention is that the STEM issue in terms of education isn't restricted to a few countries. It's global. Norma and I discovered this when we went to the BET conference in London at the beginning of the year, and everybody was talking about how corporations needed more qualified STEM workers. An international company like General Electric, who makes all these jet engines that are on every airplane that we fly on, just about, has a horrible time finding people who are qualified to build those engines because they're largely 3D printed, believe it or not. And as a result, they have $150 billion back orders of engines because they don't have enough people to manufacture these things. And as a consequence, they've invested a little bit in my company to Polar 3D to help create more qualified workers, and this applies to GE worldwide. So our assistance is global, in fact. England has had such a challenge that the BBC has created this, which is a little circuit board that's got some amazing capabilities to it. If we have time later, I can demonstrate this. But this device has been put into the hands of 1 million 10th grade children in the UK, and it's now going global. It's a very inexpensive device and is helping transform STEM education in the UK. So, which is the only country I know of that has taken on this kind of a massive initiative in their public schools. So the challenge is that's before us, and the topic of today's panel is one that applies way beyond Mexico and Brazil and even the United States to reach other countries as well.
Great, thank you, David. Fábio, could you speak to us a little bit about the private sector's responsibility in supporting education?
First, thank you very much.
You have to turn it on the top.
That's a good idea. Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. Pleasure being here. And thanks for yesterday. Right, a great evening as well. Just to be very quick, years ago when I was doing some initiatives here and there on private or very small communities, and understanding the dimension of the problem of education in Brazil, I said, listen, this is not going to be done by the private sector alone. It has to be done in partnership with the government. The issues are big, are enormous, and if we don't, the scale of the problem is so huge that, of course, only together with the government they can do it. I think the government, and yesterday I was praising, and I like to praise here Jair. Jair has been one guy who has stimulated me a lot on this, to do a partnership with the government and bringing, in that case, we brought McKinsey to the project as an example of one of the initiatives, to say, listen, we are going to bring it, and we are bringing with some of the methodology that we have on the private sector, establishing goals and PMOs and so on, so that we could actually bring efficiency and performance to something that was not in the government's culture, but the government had actually the means, the money, the infrastructure to do it. So I believe that, number one, the government alone will not do it, the private sector alone will not do it. We have to have both. And what we're bringing to the picture here also at Itaú-Social, where I'm now also devoting some time, is to bring measurements, performance. Basically, I use the expression that the good intentions are necessary but are not sufficient for us to have something which really brings results. So bringing this kind of methodology, performance, and what kind of impact are we having with that money that is being allocated? And is that the best way to allocate, which is also scarce, which is the amount of money that we have? So I think by bringing that we are actually enhancing a little bit the public education, but it's not that we want to replace, but rather we want to enhance. And last but not least, I say that maybe 10 years ago or 20 years ago, it would be very difficult to find in Brazilian society people which would be mobilized and devoting time and resources to help the public education. And nowadays, although there are not many, but there are some, and I think it's an increasing number. So I'm quite optimistic to say that education, it became a priority in several circles, and I think it's getting better and better.
Mm-hmm. Great. Just a follow-up question, Fábio. You were involved in the initial phases of the integral schools in Pernambuco, in the Northeast, and supporting that. How do you find the integral schools improving education in Brazil? The full-day schools, we call them integral schools, but they're converting half-day schools to full-day schools.
Yeah, just remember that in a regular class, people have 4 hours, 5 hours maximum, if they have 4 to 5 hours. So what we're trying to, and because the schools were so crowded, that's basically the origin of it. You had to use the same building for people to study in the morning, another group study in the afternoon, another group study at night, which was, it's an important step anyway, what they call the universalization and bringing everybody to the school. And people say, okay, that's step number 1, putting everybody in school. Now step number 2 is enhance the quality of what is being taught there. And I think we are moving in that direction very slowly. And one of the ideas is since demography is changing, buildings are there, shall we go to integral or not? I think the results, and Jair will have the numbers, but it's much better performance on people which are on the integral hours there, 7 hours, 8 hours, but it's not only a matter of opening up that time, the number of hours, it's also what you do with it. So if you have the conditions, the laboratory, or you have what to do, and you have the professors and so on. And so we have pressure sometimes from the government to speed this up and say, listen, we don't want to speed this up just to say that we have a full-time or an integral school, but rather do it according to the means so that we don't compromise on the quality. And that's what we're doing now. So the results are fantastic, but it has to be paced so that, and Pernambuco is very much advanced. I think big percent.
50%.
50% is already there. While in São Paulo it's like 10%. Yeah, it's a small number.
Of a large
yes, it's a small number. but the idea is that this is the way to go. Yeah. But it's not to go without thinking and being prepared for it. It's preparing yourself for do it and doing it with the proper conditions. So, but the results are outstanding.
Can I make a quick comment on that?
Absolutely.
You made a wonderful point. And many years ago, I was talking to someone who ran a school in the U.S., and they were going to increase the length of the school day, period. That was the big change. And I talked to the superintendent of the district, and I said, look, if you go to the doctor and he gives you medicine that makes you sick, and you now double the dose, what's the benefit going to be? And so your comment was so beautiful, because you're exactly right. If all you change is the time and you don't change the teaching methodology, then you could even make things worse.
Ronaldo, I wanted to ask you a question. Welcome. Nice to see you. You've discussed the appropriation of technology by the periphery.
Yeah.
And the trend of the periphery to access, create, and appropriate and innovate upon new technologies. Could you expand on that a little bit for us?
Sure, absolutely. So first, thanks a lot for having me here. It's really a pleasure to be discussing education and technology with all of you. Let me focus a little bit on what I've been doing regarding this issue. So the project that I've been working in the past 4 years in partnership with Lemon Foundation is actually to connect all the schools in Brazil with high broadband internet connectivity. So Brazil has right now 146,000 public schools, and it has 39 million students in those schools. and 85% of those are in urban areas, and 14.2% of those are in rural areas. So it's a huge challenge to connect the schools. So when you look at the PISA rankings, the countries which are like on the top of PISA, like Singapore, Korea, Finland, New Zealand, Australia, Ireland, they all invest in technology. When you look at their schools, they have connectivity often going from 100 megabits per second to 1 gigabit per second, so it's really high connectivity. However, when you look at the Brazilian schools, initially you might have an optimistic view because 80% of them do have connectivity. The problem is that connectivity is very low in terms of bandwidth. It's 80% of those schools, they have like less than 2 megabits per second of connection. So what does that mean? It means that if two students decide to watch a YouTube video at the same time, the connectivity is over. So as a result, the connection gets to the Brazilian schools, but they go directly to the director's office, or they go directly to the professor's meeting room. And even for those, they might be a little small in terms of bandwidth. So it never reaches the students. So what we've been doing in the past 5 years right now is to build a national broadband plan to connect specifically the schools. So we've raised how much it costs. It's not that much money, like especially when you compare with the money that has been used for illegal stuff in Brazil recently. So it's 15 billion reais would be enough in order to deploy this plan. And the challenge is how do you coordinate expenditure? So basically, right now, 17 different states in Brazil, they hire their own connectivity. So they spend a lot of money. If there were coordination between these expenditures, you could have so much more efficiency. And just to conclude quickly, Brazil could look into the experience of other countries as well. So for instance, Uruguay has created a fantastic plan called the Ceibal plan, in which all the schools have been connected. They have deployed devices for each and every student. And also countries like Mexico or even the US have very interesting models about how to connect the schools. So in my view, there is no future for education without connectivity. I think like we probably all agree about that. And in Brazil, the more time we spend without having proper connection in schools is time that we'll be lagging behind. So I think this should be the goal for, in terms of infrastructure, which is to get schools, all of them to be connected in the next 5 to 10 years. Yeah.
And a follow-up question too, Ronaldo, for you. You've also discussed the impact of technology in promoting civic participation.
Sure.
Can you talk a little bit about that and how it helps democracy?
Sure. Okay, so very quickly, it's interesting because when you look about the discussion regarding whether technology increases productivity, you have that very famous phrase from the 80s that basically says, you can look at the impact of technology everywhere except in productivity. So there's a lot of debate among economists whether it has an impact or not. The problem is, I think this conclusion is valid mostly in the developed world, because in the developing world, regardless whether there is an impact in productivity or not, technology has an impact in moving forward agendas that should have been implemented much earlier. So basically, the developing world has to face issues still like sanitation and issues like education quality, connectivity, and so many other agendas. And technology is a political instrument to advance those causes. And I have a first-hand experience with that because at my institute in Brazil, we have just released an app which allows for digital signatures for draft bills that are proposed by people. So this is interesting about Brazil. The Brazilian Constitution says that if 1% of the voters get together and propose a draft bill, that draft bill must be accepted by Congress or by the state legislative house or by the city legislative house. However, in more than 25 years of Constitution, that possibility has been used only 5 times at the federal level. One of them is in the approval of the Ficha Limpa law, which is the clean slate law, which is a law that prevents people who have been convicted criminally from running for office in Brazil. So this is a very well-recognized positive legislation that was passed in Brazil, and it only happened because 1% of the voters got there. So what we did was to create an app in which you can collect those signatures using the blockchain technology. So basically you certify the signature. It's very hard to fraud them. And interestingly, we launched this app, and in 2 months it was downloaded by 500,000 people, and we have received 7,000 draft bills proposals. So I think we are living in a moment
Wonderful.
in which we face a lack of trust in institutions. And in Brazil, this lack of trust is in record lows. So less than 7% of Brazilians think that Congress is doing a good job. That's the lowest since 1993. And when I see a device or an app like that picking up, I think there is some hope in participation. So people actually do want to participate in public decision-making, and I think technology can be an instrument for rebuilding that trust that has been lost and for building direct avenues for civic participation.
Wonderful. This is so fascinating to learn about your work, Ronaldo. These are the types of youth producing through technology to make society and humanity a better place to live, the world a better place to live. Marcos, in the program that you're running, STEM Brazil, tell us a little bit about the reaction in the classroom and the receptivity of the teachers in teaching them how to use technology in the classroom better.
We have a lot of challenges using technology at the classroom in schools because we have problems with the connectivity, we have lack of materials in labs, but we can use some technology, for example, this kind of gadget that David showed to us, demonstrated, and we can also use cell phones because if we don't have internet at school, but we can, teachers sometimes have a data plan and they can use the cell phones. So what we have, and also the students maybe, and sometimes they have better smartphones than teachers. Because they use this equipment to learn things, to research, and they use a lot of YouTube. So the reception from the teachers is super good when they saw that this use can be a solution for the problems they have in the classroom. So. If they empower the students with this technology and don't focus on the use of technology because they don't are the experts in technology, and most of times they are afraid of this use of technology. Always told to the teachers, the most important thing is the questions you are using to promote the learning with the students. So this is the thing most important in a classroom, using technology to solve problems and give a context to use this technology. So from this point of view, technology is very well received by the teachers in the program.
I agree, Marcos. One of the things we see with the students, when the teachers bring technology, the teachers become rock stars to the students, because that's what the students are interested in learning, how to use technology, how they can learn to use technology in their real lives, solving things that in their own communities. And so this is what we try to do, is bring the relevance of school learning to the student's life today and in the future, but mostly today, so that they want to continue this learning cycle. David, it might be interesting now if you could demonstrate a little activity.
Sure.
Be done in the classroom, or?
One of the things I wanted to show is based on an experiment that many children worldwide do in school, which is to take a raw egg and to drop it from some distance and to design a cushioning system so that when it hits the floor, it doesn't break. Some of you in this room have probably done that experiment when you were in school. Now, the downside of that experiment, besides the fact you lose a lot of eggs, is that the results are binary. Either the egg breaks or it doesn't. Well, the microbit that I talked about has a built-in accelerometer, and so what I did was I designed a project I'll gladly send to anybody, and Marcos will be getting this, where I did a Mars lander, because in fact the way we do get equipment onto Mars is dropping it. Okay, and it has to be cushioned so that it doesn't break when it hits the surface. So I built my Mars lander, and using software that's running on my tablet, I can now, when I drop it, come on, stop. There we go. When I drop it, I see the graph that shows the acceleration both on the z-axis as well as the x and y axes. And now this data can be exported into a spreadsheet. And we've taken a lesson that previously incorporated some of Newton's laws of physics, which is fine, and now expanded it to include mathematics, because you've got graphing, you have data analysis, and then when you design your cushions for this device, you want to get that acceleration number as low as possible. It makes a wonderful classroom project, and one that seamlessly bridges between physics and mathematics and engineering, and does all of this in the context of something that's enjoyable for children and very relevant even to the old curriculum, but totally approaching it in a new way.
Great, thanks. Marcos, do you want to talk a little bit about how you're actually introducing these types of activities into the classroom in 16 states in Brazil?
Yes, because there is, using this example, this kind of activities are different from the traditional experiments we saw frequently in the schools. So the idea is give a context, and we try to do this in STEM Brazil. We still work with the teachers in the experiments, but experiments that mean something for the lives of the students, and they know why they are learning a concept. For example, if we talk about acceleration or speed or other content, and this is something that teachers really like it because we are working with the curriculum also. That is something important to the government. So we can work with the mandatory curriculum, and we can also provide a tool that is interesting for the students, and the teachers feel comfortable and happy to see that students are really learning the concepts. So one thing is teach a concept in a traditional way, and the other thing is use an experiment that has a concept and has a context. So this way we created some activities that use simple materials like this, for example, or even simple materials to work with the teachers. And they can do this kind of experiment every 2 weeks during all the year for all the years of high schools and for chemistry, biology, physics, and math.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and Marcos, how is this program different in Brazil than STEM programs typically in the United States or the UK?
We try to create a program for all the students, because if they are not exposed, if they don't have exposure to these activities, maybe they don't know, don't know if they can be a scientist or an engineer. So the idea is change the methodology of all the teachers, so the program and the methodology can keep through the years for all the students in every school we work. So this is something really different, because we call STEM for all, what we are doing.
But how did you incorporate that in the day-to-day curriculum of the teachers? It's not an after-school program?
Not an after-school, day-to-day for all the students for all the years.
It's built into the core school day. Great.
Exactly. Even for the 4 hours they have.
I think this would be a good time to show a real quick video about the work we do so you can get a better idea about how STEM is used in the classroom. can see the materials are very simple, they're very basic, but they construct and they're innovative in creating classroom activities. Would you like to speak a little bit, Ronaldo, about your Marco Civil?
Sure, I can talk a little bit about that. Just a quick comment about STEM in Brazil. I think it's a fantastic project. I was recently visiting one advanced manufacturing school at the Tsinghua University in Peking. And I was visiting their engineering school, and it's really amazing how much engineering is getting similar to design.
Right.
And basically, the tools to approach engineering are becoming pretty much similar to this, what these kids were doing there, like with prototyping and like small modeling and that sort of thing. So I think this is actually a huge opportunity for Brazil to leapfrog, because the engineering is becoming an information layer, a design layer. There is much more flexible than what it used to be. And I think this is definitely the way to approach it. So it's also important because it reconfigures the way that kids actually approach tasks. So it's very important to work together, to do not only individual work, but actually work in groups, in pairs, and exchange ideas. And only that, I think it's a shift in the way that schools are organized in Brazil. That is very important, because the way that Brazilian students are tested right now, by means of exams like ENEM and others, when you think about the emergence of artificial intelligence technologies, you have to ask yourself, what are the skills and abilities that you have to teach kids in the future so that they can compete with the machines that we are going to deal in many of our work fields? And one fact is, if you take the Brazilian national exams and send it through an artificial intelligence, that artificial intelligence will probably solve it very easily and probably score higher than any Brazilian kid would do. So my question about this is, how do you test students about those skills? Because those are the skills that machines cannot perform.
Right.
Like the ENEM exam is something that a rather simple artificial intelligence can solve really quickly. But those skills of designing, problem solving, group cooperation, thinking, creative design, and so on, these are the skills that we are going to need.
And those are the skills that are tested in the PISA.
Yeah, absolutely.
But not so much in the local exams in our Latin American countries.
That's exactly right.
Which is a good driver for the change.
So I'm trying to see the big picture here, because we are already living in this moment in which, when you see the papers, there's all these ideas about jobs that are going to disappear. So there's the famous paper by, sorry for that, Osborne and Colfray in Oxford, basically saying that 45% of the jobs in the United States are going to disappear in the next 20 years. And that's because of automation. So basically, this is a huge challenge for education. How do we change the skills that we have to teach and basically take them closer to this model rather than the ENEM model that we have in Brazil right now?
Great.
Okay, so about the microcivil, that goes about civic participation. Sorry, I was fascinated by the education portion about it. But microcivil was a law that I was engaged from 2007 until 2014. This law was passed in March 2014. It protects free speech online, it protects net neutrality, it protects privacy, and it's considered as pretty much a landmark legislation globally. So you have people like Tim Berners-Lee, the creator of the World Wide Web, WWW, saying that this law should be considered as a model law for any country that wants to approach internet rights regulation. So it's interesting to see how this particular law became something that Brazil is known for in the international sphere. And the significant thing about this law is that it was designed collaboratively. It's probably one of the very first crowdsourced pieces of legislation anywhere. So this law was not drafted by congressmen under their closed cabinets. This was drafted by means of an online platform that was basically completely open for participation, and this process was actually very successful. So basically, it was a long process from 2007 to 2014, as I said. It was work intensive because you had to process all the comments and contributions that were collected through the platform. But in the end, participation led to better results. We basically were able to build a solid law, a much more sophisticated piece of legislation, precisely because we had what we call a multi-stakeholder approach. So rather than one particular set of stakeholders contributing to this legislation, we had basically various sectors and stakeholders actually participating in a transparent and open way. And I think the result was actually very positive. So I think this was, of course, an internet law. So people were, at the time, you have to think like 2009, Facebook was not popular, you know. 2009, the most popular social network in Brazil was Orkut, you know, which I miss a lot, but it doesn't exist anymore. Like it was Google property, and Google decided to discontinue it at some point. But at that point, it was already viable to do something like this. So with the technology we have today, with the smartphones that we have today, Brazil has more than 168 million smartphones already. And this is a huge opportunity for building participatory processes in which we can draft legislation and craft public policy as well.
Fantastic. Fantastic. We touched a little bit on the social-emotional side. Would anyone like to talk about the social-emotional development? It's such a critical part of STEM and innovation, the leadership skills, the teamwork, the working together. These are some of the things that I think in the United States we have from the time we're small kids in our public schools, you know. Last night we were talking about public speaking and speaking in front of a crowd. And a lot of the people were saying to me at the end of the evening, yes, the Americans, they do this from kindergarten when you talk about what you did over the summer. Or, you know, everyone gets up and speaks in front of the class. Sometimes these skills aren't really developed in the public school system in a similar way. So, Fábio, would you like to talk a little bit about some of this social-emotional development?
Again, I'll give Jerry, feel free to compliment, because Jerry has been
super involved,
the leader on this, on the public schools. And of course, the idea is that it's much broader. Education is much more than just going there in the class and passing on some knowledge. And yesterday I was trying to bring on my speech the idea of bringing values also, and not only talking about knowledge, but what kind of principles you want, and how do you convey that, by the way, through examples, through attitudes, and so on. And then developing social, emotional, this is extremely important. But we're starting to happen, and again, I'll really ask you to intervene here in a moment. But the question also is that are teachers prepared for that? And the answer is it's not. There is a very interesting guy called Bologna. I like him in Brazil, and he says, which is a little bit, I mean, not only his finding, but that education was based, as he says, in 1800 on three principal legs. No? Is the family would give the sociability or the respect for the elders, how to share with brothers. The religion of any kind will teach what is right and what is wrong, being very basic and superficial here. And what happened over time is that The families don't pass those things as they used to. The religion doesn't have the same influence as it had in the past. So it goes to the school to take care of everything, which of course the professor is not prepared for that. So one thing that we are doing, and I think STEM does very well, and that's the project that we are working also in Brazil, is how do you prepare the teachers to the role that society expects from them? They are not prepared for that. So when you talk about having the full-time or longer hours at school, what are they going to do with that? When you talk about social-emotional, are they prepared for that? Do they know how to handle that? The question, once they are prepared, the results are fantastic.
Yes, good morning.
Good morning.
First of all, really congratulations on this panel, and as member of the Brazilian government, I'm very proud that this kind of program is being developed in Brazil, and also I'm very happy to see how successful has been this experience to work, the government working with the private sector, because working in the government for so many years, I know how difficult it is for Brazilian government officials to work in sometimes with companies and private sector to develop specific policies, especially in education. I have a question that it's not for maybe a non-expert on education, but more a feeling I have. It's regarding the position of the teacher itself, himself in this work. In Brazil, especially in the public sector, we have huge problems in terms of the capabilities and performance of teachers. First of all, teachers in Brazil have, especially in the public area, they have very low wages historically. This problem has been a little bit corrected recently with some changes in the Brazilian legislation, but still the level of payment for teachers in Brazil, elementary and middle school, is still very low. And second, because of our system that once you pass a public exam and you become a teacher, you are a teacher for life. There is very low stimulus to you to do something else than your regular working day, because nobody is going to fire you. You know that regardless of your performance, I mean, you're going to get your payment at the end of the month, and sometimes this creates an attitude of kind of laid-back attitude from teachers. So I'd like to understand from the panel what kind of work you do with teachers to stimulate them to work in this specific area, and how they, because of course students, they are very easily to stimulate because they are young, they are curious, but how you work with teachers? Yeah.
May I just comment very quickly on that, and of course the others. This is certainly one of the most difficult things, as you very well know. There's a guy from Lehman Foundation. He says that he understood that education is science fiction. Science is, rocket science. It's very difficult to put it together. But there are three things. When we started this project with Jair years ago on how to get involved with the government of the state of São Paulo, and having the continuity he was referring to, so we had a year ago for 25 years and so on. One of the ideas was there are two objectives: to put São Paulo within one of the top 25 ratings in the ranking in the world, so on. The second one was to have the career of professor to be a desirable one. People don't want to go to be a teacher, so the best talents, they don't go to that career because it's not a dream, it's not aspirational, you don't think of which is an important role, but you really don't dream of it. So that's one thing. The second thing, that having the teachers to be assessed, their performance, has been a nightmare, but somehow it's moving somewhere. Several states are working on that, but starting to that. But it's very difficult because you cannot have any punishment. But on the other hand, we were able to establish in the state of São Paulo, which I'm more involved, some bonus. So some people, although you cannot fire, but maybe you can give some bonus for the ones which are performing well. So that was working, and then of course with the economic crisis that became more difficult, but that's another one, the second thing I want to say. And the third thing is a project we are starting now, is to select directors of the schools based on a different criteria. I think there is a system that's going on as we speak. Yesterday or the day before yesterday, something like that, a selection of directors on a standalone assessment. the director of the school makes the biggest difference on the performance of the students of that particular school. So having a different kind of director to that, and with a different profile, different capabilities and talents and so on, is something that we are being able to implement. The results on a small scale happen. Now we are putting it on a bigger scale. So these are three different fronts, but there are many more. But anyway, I agree with you. This is a challenge, but this is a given situation. And as I like to say, the question is not what life does to us, it's what do we do with what life does to us. So that's the reality. Now, how do I handle that? And I think there are initiatives being worked out on that front.
Anybody want to add anything?
Well, I'd just like to say that your comment about the role of the director in influencing the climate at the school is so essential, and I got to see that when Norma was director of his school in near Recife a few years back, and the school was transformed for the years that she was there because her vision was one that permeated the entire premise. The challenge of transforming education, though, is so great that this guy was walking along a beach and he finds a lamp, and it was rusty, so he polishes the lamp and a genie comes out. And the genie said, what would you like? And he said, I'll give you a wish. And he said, well, I like driving, so I'd like a road, please, from California to Hawaii in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And the genie said, oh my God, that's so difficult to do. I mean, my goodness, doing a road down the middle of the ocean? You must want something else. And he said, well, I'd like you to transform education. And the genie said, okay, this road, did you want 2 lanes or 4?
Exactly. Exactly. Yes, there's a microphone that's going around finally. Poor Jair didn't get his microphone.
Well, hi. Thanks for everything. It has been amazing to hear all of your information. But I have a question about connectivity. I don't know if anyone who wants to speak about it. I have been part of CEIVAL and in Habilidades Digitales para Todos in Mexico and different programs around Latin America. And sure, connectivity has been a big issue, but how do you think as a private sector or as a PhD in science, how do you think this can be solved in a specific, how do you think we can go, because we know as a society that we have connectivity in every single school in Mexico, but we know that that's not true. Because if you're in your house and your internet goes low for 1 second, you just start calling, the company, what happened with the internet? And the schools are, having a really bad conditions. Mm-hmm. So how can you decide when you have a school that is almost in ruins, like they don't have bathroom, they don't have everything that we know, how can you decide that I have to invest in connectivity, and what do you think is the best way to give connectivity, to give the connectivity enough to make the change that we need to have?
Right. Okay, so this is a very important point. The idea of investing in connectivity, it's about schools, but it's also about everything else. So Brazil used to have a national plan for connecting schools, Plano Nacional de Banda Larga. And this plan didn't work well. When you see the results and you see how it was crafted, it was basically an exchange between telecommunications obligations to deploy, for instance, public phones, and in exchange for that obligation, basically they would have to offer some specific standards for connectivities for schools. One of the reasons this plan didn't work well is because the metrics were not good. So that goes exactly to your point. For you to have a plan that works, you have to get better metrics. You know what your goals must be. You have to know that very clearly. You have to test how those goals can be achieved. And measuring that is extremely important. So for instance, the way that the former plan used to work to assess whether a school had broadband connectivity or not was actually to send the school a DSL modem, and the post office receipt that the school had actually received that DSL modem was the proof that that school was connected with broadband. Because of course, if they got the modem, of course they have connectivity, which we know is not true. So working with the metrics, I think it's very important. The second thing is the challenge of connectivity is not only, as I said, about schools, but it's about everything. And I think schools are a great starting point for deploying connectivity in a country like Brazil. So basically, if we have to take connections somewhere along all the Brazilian cities, schools are a great last mile point to start with. So it's connected with everything else. Connectivity is part of the infrastructure of the country. So basically, for a long time, we saw the internet as a sort of a consumer product. It is not. It's like an infrastructure, just like the roads, just like electricity and everything else. So this is a challenge for the country as a whole. And I think getting internet in the schools is actually urgent. The more time we don't get that, the more we will lag behind, as I said. So I think the models that we've seen in Ceibal, like Uruguay, is a fantastic experience, even the United States. And what puzzles anyone that takes the time to take a look at this issue is that there is already a lot of money being spent in connectivity in Brazil, individually by the states. Some states do it extremely poorly. Some states do it extremely well, like the case of Ceará. But the fact is, if all that pool of money was coordinated, and you get like all the economies of scale that you could get by coordinating those efforts, and you create a plan that actually makes sense, the amount of money that you would need to invest is much lower. So basically, my point is, the model we have today is probably the worst, because you spend a lot of money, what you get in exchange for your money is not enough, it's bad, and you could actually spend less and get better results. But for that, you need coordination. So that's why I think the federal government should step in, and the federal government has become increasingly interested in this. So there is a commission right now in the government working precisely about this that we are talking about. This has escalated, and we definitely think this is the way to go. So we need something to coordinate that expenditure and solve the connectivity problem, of course, for the schools, but that will have an impact for everything else as well. There are some, but the problem is Brazil is huge, right? So there's no better technology than optical fibers being deployed everywhere. There are, for instance, companies like Google and Facebook doing experiments like with drones and balloons in order to get connection, especially in remote areas. But if you don't have a backbone, with fibers somewhere to basically get your connectivity somewhere else, these efforts, they have limited impact. So it's a matter of actually coordinating infrastructure, getting the states to coordinate infrastructure, because what happens now, every state builds their own hub of fiber optics sometimes, but if you walk 3 miles away and you cross the border, that state could actually be benefiting from the effort that the other state has done. So how do you coordinate that in order to have one single info way that makes sense for the country? That can make the effort much less costlier and much more effective.
One of the things that we did in the United States back when Mr. Clinton was president was we passed a new Telecommunications Act. And it had several qualities along the lines that we're talking about. It was universal access. Whether or not the local phone company made money from it was not the issue. You had to provide it. And it also included broadband to schools and to libraries and hospitals. All of these areas were guaranteed to have really good broadband access. And we had net neutrality rules. And that was the law up until a couple weeks ago, tragically. And so now we lost net neutrality in the United States. We're about to lose some of the other things, including possibly the E-rate program, which allowed the schools to have all these connections. But we were able to achieve what you're talking about, and it worked great. But now it's a new sheriff in town, and so the rules are being changed.
Hi, my name is Edson Cadet, and I represent the Brazilian agency news called afropress.com. My question is addressed to Mr. Barbosa. As you know, there is a huge gap in Brazil between the haves and have-nots. And the vast majority of the have-nots are Afro-Brazilians. My question is how this program can help narrow this gap, not only money-wise, but racial-wise.
Good question.
Yesterday, when I had to make remarks on education, I tried to be quick, and I focus very much on the idea that the unequal distribution of income in Brazil is just a reflection of the unequal distribution of education. So the unequal distribution of income is a consequence of what we have in education. So what we have to do, and that's why I'm devoting time, and for many other people here as well, and the technology is so important so that we can bring education to everybody. So I don't think there is any way around that. In that sense, I'm also a very good partner of Maurice, which is, as you certainly know, Zé Vicente has a university exactly to give access to people on the case we're talking about, also having the racial differences and what can we do for people which are not young people, but which are already at an older age, or let's see, students for university and so on, so that we can catch up. But as I talked to Zé Vicente, which became a very good friend and has a beautiful initiative on that, it has to start from the basics. I'm also part of a foundation which looks after the first infancy, 0 to 6 years. And I was talking to Guimarães yesterday. Child which is born on a poor neighborhood, a favela, at the age of 2 to 3 years old, I don't remember now, they have a vocabulary of 800 words. If it's born on a high class or high middle class, it has 2,000 words. So it's almost 3 times as much. So, I mean, the problem is there already. I mean, for the rest, there's so many synapses which are not made and so on. So anyway, answer your question, my belief, although this is a much more complex problem, as you very well know, but it's education. It has to be broad education. Maybe technology can speed this up. It can be offered, but it's through education that you're going to solve this problem, because the difference is huge. You know, you're totally right, and that makes it an unfair society. And as I said yesterday, I say it's a cruel society because it doesn't fulfill the basic obligation of any society, which is to make sure that every citizen has the right to have an opportunity to fight for a life with dignity. He may or may not fight, he may or may not be successful, he may or may not have luck, fate, I don't know about it. I know that he must have the opportunity. And I know the problem happens in many countries, but talking about Brazil specifically, we don't do that share. So that's why I devote time, and I'm glad to see so many people devote time to education. That's what I think.
Hi, I'm Rogério. I'm a former telecom executive. I have something to complement Ronaldo and a question.
Great.
To complement, being a former telecom executive, I completely agree with Ronaldo. We missed the opportunity to put the broadband in schools. The Plano Nacional de Banda Larga didn't work for several reasons. But there is a shortcut that's not the ideal. The idea is to have fiber everywhere, and it will take time and money to make it work. But as Marcos mentioned, Brazil is a mobile-first country. So we have 160 million smartphones against 40 million broadband connections, right? And the young generation is mobile addicted. Therefore, they're used to YouTube, they're used to everything, and when you see platforms like Khan Academy and so on, people are already using that on mobile. So maybe that's one answer to, not the ideal one, but the one that might work for Brazil in the short term as a telecom infrastructure to provide connectivity and access to solutions. Mobile operators should work more to help that type of initiatives. But in the same way that we are behind in terms of connectivity and infrastructure, the other concern I have is, another point of Ronaldo, is that the nature of work will change. 40% of jobs will disappear because they will change their every nature. And we still will think about going to high school and going to college and getting an engineering degree and so on. We are starting to see the demand for abilities, skills, and knowledge are changing very fast. Seeing artificial intelligence, self-driving cars, and all the other stuff that might be fulfilling through nano degrees and other forms of access to knowledge or education. And my concern is that, as in the telecommunication space, in the education, aren't we missing something else to leapfrog from just giving the skills of the traditional education, but also complementing with coding or capacity to, even kids that won't go to college will be ready for this new type of jobs that will require capabilities that are not taught in the college. David could answer that, or anyone that could jump in.
Well, I think that your mention of coding is interesting because that was, there's been a recent study that's been published that says that the high-paying jobs require some understanding of coding. And what's happened is we've created a culture of app users, people who know how to download apps into their phone and use them. That's good. But they have no clue how to write their own software. And again, this is a global problem. So one of the solutions that was developed in the UK, sorry to keep going back there, is the invention of the Raspberry Pi computer. And that was created simply because at Cambridge University, students were coming in for degrees in computer science who never wrote one line of code in their life. And so these two professors got together and designed the Raspberry Pi, which is a very inexpensive computer, with the idea that it was so affordable that kids could learn to program on this machine. And it's been hugely successful as a product. And I've had a good conversation with one of the designers of it, and they're very happy with the consequence so far because this is really spreading worldwide. We're seeing in the United States something called Hour of Code, where we get kids, doing projects and things of that sort. So it's becoming more common. I know President Obama invested $1 billion into coding for American schools. Don't know how that stands right now, but in any event, there is an awareness of the very things you're talking about, and it certainly spreads all over. And if you take a look at Recife, with Porta Digital, which was created some years back by, at that time, he was the Secretary of Science, Technology, and the Environment, Claudio Marinho, and is centered around a research group from the Federal University of Pernambuco called CESAR. That has blossomed to the point that there are huge investments from companies like IBM, Motorola, others, who are having software written in Brazil. And there are now 250 companies on the island of Recife associated with Porta Digital, and another 150 on the mainland part of Recife. And it is now, there's a book that talks about the hotspot for innovation worldwide, and one of the places that gets its own chapter in this book is Porta Digital in Recife. So we know that success is possible because this has been going for quite some years now, and it's growing, not diminishing, even with the economic hard times.
But not a very well-known fact, even for Brazilians.
Yeah, but should the policymakers add to the basic curriculum things like entrepreneurships, coding, this type of thing, on top of the STEM curriculum, and of course the private initiatives, big institutions like Itaú and so on, should pressure the government to add to the curriculum skills that will enable to have better workers for productivity or this type of jobs?
There's a public school in Recife. I forget the name. Norma, do you remember? Is it Galileo? But you know the school I'm talking about. We visited there. It's a public school that has entrepreneurship curriculum, and it's a high school, and the students decide, are they going to be designers or different skills, and every one of them is basically guaranteed a job when they finish, and there's now a waiting list to get into the public school, and parents are taking their children out of the private school so that they can go to this public school. And I would love to see that school replicated throughout the country. And one of the people who helped make the original change was with Cesar.
Well, thank you, everyone. I see there's more questions, but do we have time for one more? Okay, one more question.
Thank you.
One more question, and then we'll wrap up.
My name is Herbert Toller, and I represent Zoll LLC. We are a development company that is looking at emerging markets and looking at forward to connecting, best in class with the local Brazilian community. My question is, with the arrival of international education companies like the Avenue School, how is that blending into what is going on in Brazil at this time?
Well, for those of you who don't know, the Avenue School is a school chain for very top AAA students. It's a private school, and they have certain schools in key capitals throughout the world. I think their school is very much not related to a lot of the public school issues that we're talking about.
They have STEM training, and that's not a problem or anything?
I'm sure they do, yes. Yes, I think so.
Connectivity, they get
broadband, it's all, they have a lot of money. They have a lot of money. They have it all. We all aspire to that for our public schools. But thank you, everyone. That's the goal, to have every school at that level. Thank you, Ted.
Very good. Well, I really want to thank Kelly and the panel. I thought it was a great discussion. We, the Chamber, are proud to be able to be involved in something like this and get these perspectives and insights, and I do all what we can do to improve Brazil, which can only help all of us. So, well, thank you very much. You've done a great job. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Ted.